Hello everybody, and today we're going to be continuing with part 3 of the Jack Kruse, Andrew Huberman, Rick Rubin podcast series breakdown, and today we're going to be talking about semiconductors. So first we have to establish what a semiconductor is. So I think the best way to think about a semiconductor is to realize that the answer to what it is really sort of in the name. It is a semiconductor. So you've probably heard of the term insulators, which are things that do not conduct electricity, and conductors, which are things that do conduct electricity. And so a semiconductor is literally something that sort of conducts electricity, or probably better said is that it does conduct electricity, but not nearly as well as a conductor, but much better than an insulator. So it's basically in between these two. And the reason that semiconductors are so valuable in computing is because basically, with a semiconductor, you can actually modulate the electrical conductivity of the semiconductive, protein in the biological case, based on adding different dopants to the actual semiconductor. So, the special thing about semiconductors is that their conducting properties can actually be altered in useful ways by introducing impurities into the crystal structure, aka doping. So what this means is, and Dr. Jack Kruse talked about this on the podcast, where when we introduce different dopants, so we add a molecule of copper to the bone, it actually changes the electrical conductivity of the semiconductor, and it also changes the light frequencies that it can absorb, emit, and work with. And that, of course, changes the entire game. And that's really the main point that Dr. Jack Kruse was talking about in this podcast, and with regards to semiconductors and why semiconductors are so important and why the different dopants that we use are so important, because the different dopants actually change the band gap of the semiconductor, which controls both the way it works with electricity and the way it works with light. So let's go ahead and talk about this here. So semiconductors can display a range of useful properties, including passing electric currents more easily in one direction than the other. That's the DC electric current. That's Becker's regeneration current that I've talked about. And so the DC electric current, that actually stands for direct current. So semiconductors can actually pass currents just in one direction, whereas AC currents, which is what our entire power grid is based on, which is why it's so harmful, and this is why Dr. Kruse has a problem with it, is because our entire power grid is based on AC electrical currents, whereas us humans, we are based on DC electricity, DC currents. And so this is what part of what semiconductors can do. They can pass a current in only one direction, or in much more easily in one direction than the other, basically making it a DC current. And this is what Becker's current is. It's a DC electric current, and it's the regeneration and healing current in mammals, which is why it's so important. And then the other important unique property that semiconductors have is that they can have varying sensitivity to light and temperature. So as talked about before, semiconductors can absorb specific frequencies of light and then emit other different frequencies of light based on their band gap, which is based on the atomic molecular organization and structure of the semiconductor, and then the dopant that's put on it, which changes the band gap. And then additionally, semiconductors have varying sensitivities to different temperatures. So this is actually one of the big reasons why Dr. Kruse loves cold exposure and talks about it so much, is because semiconductors actually work better in cooler temperatures. And so when you provide a cooler environment, cooler temperature for the semiconductor to work in, it can actually increase the frequency and that it can work with, and actually change some of the properties of the semiconductor. So that's a really important point to make as well. And so then lastly, I just want to reemphasize, so the band gap of a semiconductor directly controls its light emission spectrum. So the band gap directly controls the light that a semiconductor can emit, meaning that the difference between the valence band here and the conduction band here, so the difference between the valence band and conduction band actually determines the wavelength of light the semiconductor will emit when electrons transition between them. So when electrical current is passing through a semiconductor, this band gap, so the difference between the valence band and the conduction band, actually determines the light frequencies that the semiconductor can use. And again, this can be changed based on the dopant that is added to it, based on whether a copper is added to it, or whether a phosphorus or magnesium molecule is added to it. And this actually goes back to the importance of the atomic molecular organization of the semiconductor and in a cell that Dr. Kruse also mentioned in the podcast. This is why he emphasizes so much, because the dopant that you use actually changes the band gap of the semiconductor, which changes the frequencies of light that it can emit. So that's a really important point that I wanted to make, and just explain the basics of how a semiconductor works and how biological semiconductors are acting in us. So now I want to talk about the history of research semiconductors, of biological semiconductors in humans. So it all starts with a man named Albert St. Georgi, who is a very distinguished scientist. He was a Nobel Prize winner. And what's interesting is, in his Nobel Prize speech in 1941, he basically mentioned that he thinks all biological proteins may be semiconductors and that they appear to have an electronic structure. And he didn't know that, but he just mentioned his hypothesis in this speech. And what's interesting is Dr. Robert Becker was actually a medical student at the time in the crowd listening to this speech. And 20 years later, he basically proved that it was true in bone. And so he found that collagen is the N-type semiconductor and apatite is the P-type semiconductor. And so what this means is that all fascia, all bone, and all connective tissue in the human body has semiconductive properties. And that's where this word, and Dr. Jack Kruse actually used this word. In fact, he wrote a whole blog series named tensegrity. And so this tensegrity system basically means that we have this entire system that reaches literally everywhere in the human body, basically via the connective tissue. And it actually even goes inside every cell via these integrin proteins, which actually span from outside the cell to the inside of the cell. So they actually connect the extracellular connective tissue with the inside of the cell. And in fact, the integrin proteins actually connect specifically the connective tissue outside the cell with the cytoskeleton proteins inside the cell. So this tensegrity system, literally the semiconductive tensegrity system, literally reaches everywhere in the body, including inside cells, specifically via the integrin protein that we found only pretty recently in 2014. And that connects the connective tissue outside the cell to the cytoskeleton inside the cell. And it reaches the entire body. And so basically what you realize from this is that the entire body is one interconnected semiconductive electrical system. And additionally, these semiconductors are also emitting light, especially when they're, basically Dr. Kruse talked about how collagen actually emits light basically when it's compressed, which is an important concept. And so you can see that the importance of this concept, that basically our entire body is one completely interconnected electrical system that is also emitting light. And obviously this is not well known in mainstream science, but is extremely important and has huge implications for how we really should be living and where we should be putting research money, and ultimately for health, aging, and disease, and things that are really true versus things that aren't. So now I want to talk about the main biological semiconductor molecules. So we talked about tissue. So collagen is basically the main semiconductive tissue. And again, it's so important because it reaches basically everywhere in the body and creates this completely interconnected semiconductive electrical system in the body, that's why Dr. Becker named his book The Body Electric, because the entire body is basically one completely interconnected electrical system. But additionally, we have these really important biological molecules, these specific molecules. And so the most important one is melanin. Dr. Kruse obviously emphasized that really heavily in the podcast, and I'm going to explain why. And then additionally, two of the other big ones are hemoglobin and DHA. And then the main semiconductor molecule in plants that allowed for basically plant life and evolution is chlorophyll. And so we're not going to go into depth on that in this podcast. We're going to stick to the ones in humans, but just important to mention that chlorophyll was basically the main semiconductor plant that allowed for plant life to exist. So first we're going to talk about melanin. So melanin has a huge band gap, and this is really important because basically what it allows, remember again, as I just talked about, so the band gap determines the frequencies of light that it can work with. And basically, since melanin has a huge band gap, it can basically absorb the entire electromagnetic spectrum of frequencies, which makes it an extremely unique molecule. And so it actually absorbs and uses that energy, again, basically from the entire electromagnetic spectrum, potentially, although it really, especially works with light. as Dr. Kruse talks about. And so it absorbs and uses that energy from light to charge separate nearby water molecules to create molecular oxygen, molecular hydrogen, and at least 4 free electrons. And what's interesting is that these can be used through the electron transport chain in the mitochondria. Because again, and if you don't know this, please go watch my previous videos on the mitochondria, especially my 3rd and 1st YouTube videos, as I really go into depth on the mitochondria and explain basically the entirety of how it works and Dr. Doug Wallace's work. But essentially, all you need to run the mitochondria and make ATP is oxygen, hydrogen, and free electrons. And that's exactly what melanin creates when it absorbs all of this light energy. It uses it to charge separate water and create these constituents, which is all we need to run the electron transport chain in the mitochondria and make energy. And then of course, when we make energy, we also make these biophotons of light, which Dr. Kruse has talked about as being extremely important. So you can see how this melanin molecule is extremely important. Additionally, when it does this, it also creates, it's creating these free electrons. We can also move these electrons throughout the system. And again, this ties in directly to the last slide because we just talked about how basically all of the fascia and connective tissue is all the semiconductive, completely interconnected electrical matrix, this electrical system. So we can actually use these electrons to move throughout the system for other purposes, and especially for basically antioxidant effects, where if we have enough electrons in the system, especially through things like grounding, we can actually move these electrons through this completely interconnected semiconductive electrical system and use them as antioxidants to be able to quell unnecessary inflammation. And as we probably know, low level, just chronic inflammation is a huge problem in all of the major chronic diseases, especially things like autoimmune disease. So this is a really important mechanism that I hope I was able to explain well. And so then additionally, what's interesting is melanin is very often right next to the mitochondria, and there's papers on this that I've read that have confirmed this. And melanin sheets right by the mitochondrial colonies. Basically what melanin is doing is it's absorbing the UV biophotons that Dr. Jack Kruse talks about that the mitochondria make during mitochondrial metabolism. It's absorbing these UV biophotons the mitochondria emit and using these high energy photons that it absorbs to charge separate the water to actually create more of these constituents to either run through the mitochondria to make more energy or to move through this interconnective tensegrity system to actually perform antioxidant purposes. All of these really important things. These melanin sheets by the mitochondria are actually absorbing these photons, and it appears using it to charge separate water to create these really important substrates for either energy creation or antioxidant purposes, etc. So hopefully you can see how melanin is this extremely important molecule. And again, Dr. Jack Kruse talks about how via this mechanism that I just laid out, it literally creates more energy in the system, which is literally what allowed us to actually innovate bigger brains and as humans and be able to create the more complex nervous systems, more complex and bigger brains, and the more complex organisms that modern humans are from chimps. This mechanism via this semiconductor melanin, via this mechanism right here that I just laid out, is literally the mechanism by which that occurs. So hopefully I was able to explain that well and have a better understanding of why he talks about it so much and via what the actual mechanism is for melanin being so important in actually innovating bigger brains in humans. And just as a quick thing for people that don't know, so melanin is created via the gene POMC, and so that's actually the connection from melanin to POMC for anybody that didn't understand that, and why Dr. Kruse talks about the POMC gene so much is because POMC, when it gets hit by a certain frequency of UV light, actually creates melanin, and then melanin is able to do its function. So that's kind of the connection there for anybody that didn't know that. So the next semiconductor that I want to talk about is hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is another really important semiconductor. It absorbs between 250 and 600 nanometer light. And so what's interesting is Dr. Kruse has described hemoglobin as a ferry boat for light. And so just some of the basics of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a protein in the blood. It travels through the arterial system, and it's the protein that actually binds oxygen and then delivers oxygen to the tissues and then basically releases the oxygen once it's by the target tissue. Then the oxygen obviously goes to the mitochondria and is the terminal electron acceptor in the inner mitochondria, which actually allows for the production of ATP and energy to take place. So basically, hemoglobin, what's actually happening is hemoglobin is actually absorbing sunlight as it travels through the arteries, through the arterial system, and gets to the arterioles near the surface of the skin, and then it's releasing that light once it gets close to its target tissue. And so the mechanism of how this works is actually an original hypothesis, an idea of mine, and I actually want to have Dr. Kruse on a podcast soon to ask him about this and get his confirmation or thoughts on to whether this is actually how it works. But how I think it's actually working is, so hemoglobin has a certain band gap when it's saturated with oxygen, which is 250 to 600 nanometer light, and it actually has a different band gap when it's not associated with oxygen, so when no oxygen is bound to the hemoglobin. But so as the hemoglobin is traveling through the arterioles close to the skin, it's absorbing this certain frequency of sunlight, 250 to 600 nanometer light, as it's traveling through the arterioles close to the skin. And again, this is why it's so important to be receiving daily sunlight, because this is only happening assuming you're actually outside in the sunlight. So just another reason why getting your healthy amount of daily sun exposure is really important. But so as the hemoglobin gets close to the target tissue, the oxygen tensions change and oxygen actually disassociates from hemoglobin. And then how this actually works is how the oxygen gets to the mitochondria is that oxygen is then drawn via the magnetic force. So as Dr. Kruse talked about in the podcast, oxygen is the only paramagnetic gas on the periodic table. And it's actually drawn via the magnetic force to the spinning ATP synthase enzyme in the mitochondria. And so the spinning ATP synthase enzyme is literally a spinning turbine. And what happens is when an electric current, which is present in the inner mitochondrial membrane via the electron transport chain, so when an electric current runs through a spinning turbine, it creates a magnetic field. And then oxygen, which is a paramagnetic gas, is actually drawn to this ATP synthase enzyme. And it is the terminal electron acceptor, so it accepts the terminal electron at cytochrome 4 in the mitochondria. And so what happens is, as the oxygen actually disassociates from the hemoglobin molecule and is drawn to the ATP synthase enzyme's magnetic field, this is what I believe causes the release of light to the nearby cells. So when the oxygen disassociates, that actually causes a change in the semiconductor, and then this allows hemoglobin to actually release its light to the nearby cell, which actually helps accentuate the metabolism and health of the cell. And so it was Dr. Kruse's hypothesis that blood is basically, and hemoglobin specifically, is actually a ferry boat for light. And so this is my hypothesis of how it actually works and how the hemoglobin is actually able to release the light to the target tissue. And so hopefully I'll be able to have him on a podcast soon and be able to confirm or disconfirm this hypothesis with him. But this is my hypothesis of how it actually works. And again, it's just another reason why healthy daily sunlight exposure is critically important, because our tissues need the right light frequencies to be able to function well and stay healthy. So the next semiconductor that I want to talk about is DHA. So DHA is an extremely important and very highly evolutionarily conserved molecule. So DHA is the only fatty acid that actually has not been replaced in basically 600 million years, of evolutionary biology. So it's an extremely well-conserved fatty acid. And DHA is found in essentially every single cell membrane in the human body except for the inner mitochondrial membrane. And the reason for that is because the inner mitochondrial membrane is an ancient bacterial membrane, because the mitochondria themselves are actually ancient bacteria. And so the central retinal pathways are loaded with DHA, as Dr. Kruse has talked about many times. And additionally, the rod and cone photoreceptors actually use DHA. DHA actually gets incorporated into the photoreceptors. So it has special properties that allow it to interact with light in very unique and important ways. And so as you can see, DHA is very important for vision and photoreception, as well as being very important for the integrity and health of our cell membranes, and for cell membrane function, because our cell membranes do a lot more than just hold the cell together. They participate in electrical potentials, and there's ion channels involved. So the actual health of the cell membrane is very important, and DHA plays a big role in that. And DHA is also much less inflammatory than other molecules. For example, there's a very inflammatory molecule that comes from omega-6 fatty acids called arachidonic acid. However, DHA is much less inflammatory, or basically anti-inflammatory. And so the more DHA that makes up your cell membranes, you basically have less inflammation, and it's much less anti-inflammatory. So that's another additional benefit, in addition to being very important in vision, and also having unique properties, the way it interacts with light and the electrical potentials that allow it to basically be incorporated and used in vision. So lastly, it's also very important for timing. And this is what Dr. Jack Kruse has talked about in many podcasts and many presentations he's done, where DHA actually, and the fact that the central retinal pathways are so loaded with it, actually plays a role in Einstein's general and special relativity and the GPS analogy. And so the GPS analogy that he uses is that basically Garmin has a satellite, orbiting the Earth, and the clock in the GPS or in the satellite, in the Garmin satellite, or in the Verizon satellite, needs to run 38 microseconds faster than the clock in the phone that's receiving the signal from the satellite. And that's due to Einstein's general and special relativity. And Dr. Kruse has hypothesized that the clock in the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus also has to run just a little bit faster than all the clocks distal to it, all the clocks that are lower to it. So the clock in your liver or the clock in your big toe has to run just a little bit slower than the clock in the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus. And so what allows the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the clock in there, to actually run a bit faster? So there is, in addition to there being fibers, nerve fibers that run from the eye to the thalamus, and then to the occipital lobe in the back of the brain, where visual perception is actually performed. So that's normal vision, and how you actually interpret the images, the light coming through your eyes, as an actual vision of the world around you, of the environment around you. So in addition to those fibers that come from the retina and then to the thalamus and to the occipital lobe to do vision, there are also fibers that go straight back to the midbrain. And these these fibers that go from the eye to the midbrain go to the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus, and it regulates circadian rhythm and timing. And Dr. Kruse has stated that pathway is loaded with DHA, and the reason for that is because this clock has to actually run a little bit faster than all the clocks peripheral to it. And because DHA is such a good semiconductor, it actually conducts the signal from the environment to the eyes to the midbrain extremely quickly. And that allows this clock to run a little bit faster than all the clocks distal to it, and actually maintain the general and special relativity principle. So that's Dr. Kruse's theory on that. Very interesting theory. I'd actually love to ask him more about that in the future in a podcast that we'll hopefully be able to do soon. But essentially, that is kind of an overview of why DHA is such a critical molecule for health and wellness. So in this last slide here, I want to talk about earthing or grounding, because it's very important, and it also ties in very tightly to this semiconductor story that we've been talking about here. So in this podcast, Dr. Jack Kruse stated that grounding is huge. So Rick Rubin asked him what he thinks about grounding, and Dr. Kruse was like, oh, grounding is huge. And so I actually happen to have some expertise on this subject. I've read every single paper in the medical literature, at least that I could find, on earthing or grounding. And also I've done some research on semiconductors, and I've learned quite a bit about that. So I just want to talk about semiconductors and their importance to grounding, and then the importance of grounding to human health. So it appears that we can absorb electrons from the earth, probably through both our mucous membranes. So for example, the mucous membranes in our nose and mouth, and then also through the eccrine sweat glands on our hands and feet. And so Dr. Kruse actually talked about this, how we are the only animals, as far as I'm aware, that actually have eccrine sweat glands on both our hands and feet. And so what's interesting is it appears that these glands basically, so they can secrete, obviously sweat, and then that sweat on the hands and feet, when we're actually connected to the earth, so when our hands and feet are actually connected to the earth, they actually make us more conductive, so we can actually absorb more electrons. So Dr. Kruse has actually hypothesized that he believes basically that we evolved these eccrine sweat glands on our hands and feet so that we could actually be more conductive with the earth and actually absorb more electrons when our hands and feet are on the earth. And of course, electrons are extremely important for antioxidant defense, as well as also for an anti-inflammatory defense, as also for we need electrons to run through the electron transport chain in the mitochondria, which is how we generate energy and ATP. Additionally, through Einstein's photoelectric effect, which Dr. Jack Kruse talks about a lot and talked about a lot on this podcast, electrons are basically the only subatomic particle that can actually absorb light and interact with light. And that's actually how we store photonic energy from the sun, is through electrons. So you need to be able to absorb a lot of the electrons through grounding in order to actually absorb more light energy from the sun. So this is a really important concept. And you can read some of the paragraphs I've written here, which basically summarize what I just said, and then the importance of grounding for human health. It's a really fascinating and very safe thing that we can implement in our lives to actually help decrease, our risk of chronic disease and actually absorb more absorb more energy into the system, which can actually, help us, be more healthy essentially and avoid, entropy and aging, as Dr. Kruse has talked about. And again, that tensegrity system, that semiconductive system through the fascia and through all of the connective tissues, which are, as Dr. Robert Becker proved, are all semiconductors. So these tissues basically are all semiconductors, and so they can actually move electrons anywhere throughout the system, and actually, contribute to antioxidant defenses and also to energy metabolism and creation in different tissues. So this is basically the importance of grounding, is that we can absorb electrons into the system, which actually also helps us be able to absorb more photonic energy from the sun. And then additionally, through this tensegrity system, because all of these connective tissues are actually semiconductors, as Dr. Robert Becker proved, we can actually move these electrons throughout the body and system to wherever they are needed most. So again, we have this built-in system to move these very valuable electrons wherever we need to. And all we need to do is go outside and absorb more electrons by connecting with the earth, which unfortunately is something that many of us are, and many people, especially in America, are hardly doing at all. And the question is does this contribute to the major chronic disease epidemic that we're seeing in America and many of the first world countries, and really just all over the world? And I believe it absolutely is playing a huge role. The lack of grounding, the lack of earthing and getting outside, and the lack of absorbing these free electrons, I think is playing a major role in many of the chronic disease ailments and lack of health that we see today in many countries around the world. And then lastly, I just want to say thanks for watching. And if you liked the video, please consider leaving a like, comment, or subscribing, as it really helps support the channel. This video is purely for educational purposes. This is not medical advice, and all opinions in this video are my own, and this is purely my interpretation of Dr. Kruse's work. Thank you.